welcome to Julie Reads Her Bookshelf. I'm Julie. For those of you who are new to this channel, this is a channel where I read through all of the books on my bookshelf that is unread until we reach zero. And as I keep saying every time, we are a long way from zero. This is a late wrap up of my May reading. I had a bit of a hard month in May. I was really busy at work, but also coupled with that, the books that I was reading in May didn't really grab me that much. So you can't really tell from the number of books. I tend to kind of get through about 2 or 3 books every month, which isn't a lot, but you know, it's a lot for someone who works in corporate law and works 60, 70-hour weeks. The page numbers are more telling. May is probably the month that I read the least number of pages. And so I'm sort of going through what is for me a little bit of a reading slump. But never mind, I still got through 3 books. And so let's start with the first one. The first book I read is The Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. Now, this is part of my year of reading Victorians. So far we've read a little bit of George Eliot, we've read Thackeray, Vanity Fair, and I thought, you know what, it's the Victorians, we've got to read some Dickens. So I picked the thinnest Dickens book that I've got, which is The Tale of Two Cities. And this was just okay. So for those of you who don't know, The Tale of Two Cities was set during the French Revolution, and it follows the lives of a series of characters, but mainly it focuses on Charles Darnay, who's a French aristocrat living in London, and also Sydney Carton, who's an English lawyer. And there's a kind of duality that runs through this book. So it's the tale of two cities, the two cities being London and Paris. But then there's also 2 heroes in the novel. There's Sydney and Charles, and the 2 of them, it's kind of important to the plot that the 2 of them look alike. They also are both in love with the same woman, who's Lucy Manette. I guess the reverse of that is that their personalities could not be more different. Darnay is from an aristocratic background, but he renounces his family name, he renounces his title, and moves to London to live a modest life where he falls in love with Lucy. And Lucy is the daughter of Dr. Manette, who also becomes quite an important character later on in the story. And on the other hand, we've got this other hero who's Sydney Carton, who he's kind of this roguish, quite disillusioned lawyer. And he sort of has these kind of weird self-destructive tendencies, which also becomes quite important to the plot later on in the book. Sydney also develops feelings for Lucy, which are quite unrequited. I won't go into too much detail about the plot of this book. Basically, all of the characters' lives gets entangled with the events of the French Revolution, and the second half of the book becomes quite violent and brutal. And the ending of this book, for those people who have read it, is quite something. I didn't love this book. I wish I did. I really didn't love this book. It was just okay. And I'll start with what I thought was good. What I thought was really good about this book is Dickens's portrayal of the brutality of the revolution and how much harm there can be done in the name of the greater good. That theme was beautifully explored in the second half of the book, and I think it remains really relevant and poignant today. As with what limited Dickens I have read, I found his writing to be incredibly atmospheric, and he's very good at depicting a place, whether it be London or revolutionary Paris. He really just sets the scene so wonderfully. So that's what's good about this book. What I really didn't enjoy about this book are basically the characters. So all of the female characters, and this is perhaps quite a common criticism of Dickens, the female characters in this book are incredibly simple. They are virtuous or they are odd, or they are evil. And because they are only that kind of one thing, they're not complex or compelling as characters. They are just, simple. And likewise with the male characters. Now, because it's a story of the two heroes and the two cities, you start to realize over the course of the book that it's a one-sided duality. That is to say, one city stands out far more than the other, being Paris, where all of the political intrigue and the turbulence happens, really kind of comes to the fore as opposed to London, who's more emblematic of kind of the peace and calm. Whereas of the two characters, Sydney is far more interesting than Charles Darnay. Charles Darnay is, again, virtuous and honorable and good. And because he's all of those things as a literary character, he is just boring. Whereas Sydney, because he has that kind of weird self-destructive element, and he's morally a little bit more grey, he comes across as far more interesting a character, and that really plays well into the book, the ending of the book. Despite my objections, I will have to say this is one of the better endings I've read in a book. It's quite a punch in the gut when you read it, and so I won't spoil anything for anyone, but I did think that I would, despite all of my objections, I would remember the ending of this book for quite some time. So that's Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. It's sort of a middle of the road kind of read for me. It wasn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, but it was not a standout in the context of all of the other Victorian works that I read this year. Now, the second book I read, I really just had such a strong aversion to it, and that's Perfume by Patrick Suskind. Now, I wasn't quite expecting to read this book right after The Tale of Two Cities, and if I had known better, I probably would have spaced it out a little bit more, because the experience of reading these two books back to back is that I was stuck plot-wise in 18th century France for two books in a row. But that's not my objection to this book. I'll talk a little bit about why I just had such a strong aversion to this novel. For those who don't know, so this book is about the protagonist, Jean-Baptiste Grenouille. He is born from kind of a lower socioeconomic background in 18th century France. He was born with an extraordinary sense of smell, in that he's able to not only detect and follow scents, even very, very faint scent, in a almost kind of like canine way, but he's able to dissect scents, and this becomes the central obsession and passion of his life. And Grenouille was abandoned by his mother early on in life, and he grew up sort of working in tanneries until he eventually works himself into a perfume shop and becomes trained as a perfumier. And his obsession with scents kind of then takes quite a dark turn when he becomes captivated by the idea of capturing the scent of prepubescent young women, and he starts to get quite murderous. And so this is a story about murder, it's about obsession, it's about beauty and the power of scents. And all of those things seem like a really intriguing backdrop for a novel. But my really strong aversion to what happens in this book comes out of its hypermasculinity. This book is a book where none of the women, and there are a lot of women in this book, but none of them have any interiority. That is to say, at no point in this book do we ever get inside the mind of a female character. The women in this book are only ever portrayed as praise, or they're portrayed, as is the case of Grenouille's mother, as cold and evil. And so you really set up this duality of the object of desire versus the object of disgust. and there's such a strong vein of misogyny that runs through the book that I just found it really, really off-putting. And look, part of that is intentional. It's intentional in the sense that this is a book about a man murdering women. And I'm not spoiling anything, it's literally in the title, Story of a Murder. So this is a book that is about misogyny. It was really written in such a hyper-masculine way that I really just couldn't identify with it in any way. So what I got out of it was about 300 pages of a novel that was written entirely from a male perspective with no female presence other than, women as prey. And despite knowing that part of it is intentional by the author, I don't think all of it was intentional. And so I really just struggled with this book. And I guess it's not a bad thing in the book that it elicits a strong sense of antipathy rather than just indifference. But yeah, I'm not sure I could read this book again. So this was not only a book that I didn't enjoy, but it was a book that I actively disliked. So having read two books then set in 18th century France, I felt like I needed something drastically different. And so we went from 18th century France to 1920s America with The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Now, I was talking with a friend recently about going back and reading some books on my bookshelf that I missed during adolescence. And we were discussing kind of your typical adolescent books. And what I mean by that is that there are some books out there that most people read when they're in their teenage years or in their early 20s. So The Great Gatsby is a prime example of that. Most people come across this book at school or in the early years of their university studies. And if you kind of miss your boat then, it's really hard to then get back into it because it's a book that everyone else has read and you feel like you want to read the best, the newest, the most in vogue thing rather than, the book that everyone read in high school. And so I've never read The Great Gatsby. In fact, my reading of American literature is quite spotty. Like I'm fairly well read in terms of more contemporary works of American literature, but in terms of the classics that people would study at school and that everyone would read as kind of the quintessential American novel, I've actually read so few of them. And so I thought, you know what, let's read The Great Gatsby. And you know what? It was a really, really good book. For those who don't know, Jay Gatsby is a wealthy and mysterious man living in West Egg, Long Island. And the story is written from the perspective of his neighbor, Nick Carraway. So Nick moves next door to Gatsby and he learns about Gatsby and sort of his shady background dealings through some of the extravagant parties that Gatsby used to throw from his home. And over time, he finds out that Gatsby has this great love that he lost, Daisy. So Daisy and Gatsby were a couple, but now Daisy is married to quite a wealthy man called Tom Buchanan. And Daisy and Tom live across the bay, also in Long Island. And part of the backstory to Gatsby's big parties is that he was hoping to get her attention through these great big gatherings. When we first meet Tom and Daisy, Tom's having an affair with the wife of a garage owner, Mrs. Wilson, and Gatsby and Daisy also end up having an affair when they reconnect, and all kinds of strange dynamics come to the fore between the four of them. Themes of wealth, social class, of unrequited love, long lost love, and of course that forever theme in a lot of American novels, which is the idea of the American dream. And I sort of really, really enjoyed it. I'm very happy that I didn't read this for school because a lot of the books that I read for school were ruined for me by school. So I'm very happy I missed out on reading this as part of my secondary education. Because I really enjoyed The Great Gatsby. Hot take, The Great Gatsby is really good. What I liked about it was this superficial glamour, and then underneath that glamour there was so much kind of melancholy and deceit and violence and obsession, and in the end, total disillusionment. And so this is a really short book that packs a lot, and I thought Fitzgerald wrote it beautifully. I don't know that I need to recommend The Great Gatsby to anyone, but what I would recommend is that if you do have these books that you missed during adolescence, books that everyone else has read as part of their education, or books that you should have read when you were young, I do recommend going back and actually revisiting them later on in life and seeing how many of them actually stand up to the test of time, but also stand up to the maturity that you hopefully have developed since your teenage years. So The Great Gatsby is one of them, but I would say Orwell, much of George Orwell's writing, most people read during their adolescence. Catcher in the Rye is a classic example of another adolescent book that comes to define a lot of people's love of reading. Jane Eyre is another example, I think, that a lot of people read Jane Eyre relatively young in life, and if they miss the boat, they don't tend to come back to the Bronte sisters as much. So yeah, I would highly recommend doing that, because I found it to be quite a fruitful exercise, and I'm gonna have a look through my bookshelf to see what other books there are that I should have read when I was a younger woman. So there you are. We have 3 books in May. We have The Great Gatsby, we have Perfume by Patrick Suskind, and last but not least, A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, as part of my year of reading Victorians. And so I started the beginning of May with 79 unread books. So taking off 3, that leaves us with 76. So we are slowly but surely working our way back to 0. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back with another video probably in about 2 weeks. But until then, see you BookTube.